Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are in the United States. My name is Daryl Wilson, and I serve as the director of the Diversity and Inclusion Team for the American Bar Association's Young Lawyers Division. I wanted to just take this time to welcome you all to the Diversity Dialogue discussion, which is entitled Gerrymandering and its Impact on Communities of Color. Again, I'm very thankful and appreciative for everyone that has joined the program today, and I'm looking forward to this exciting discussion. But first, I would like to give a special thanks to our supporters for this program. We've had the diversity dialogue discussion here for a few years, and normally we would have it at our mid-year conference as a breakfast, but due to the virtual nature of our conferences, we're here today having this program. So again, our various supporters are Walmart and the Section of Litigation. I want to take the time to thank them for their continued support of this program. And right now I want to flip it over without taking too much time to Justin Jack, our Vice Director for the Diversity and Inclusion Team. Justin, to you.
Thank you, Daryl. I want to again thank everyone for coming out. I know the lunch hour event is not always an easy ask, so I appreciate everyone spending time and devoting their lunch hour, I guess donating their lunch hour to us on this Wednesday. Again, this is our kind of annual event where we get a chance to have deep discussions and breakout groups about pressing issues that affect both the legal community and also the community at large. Personally, this is one of my favorite events of the year. Sometimes we get wrapped into our own work and personal lives, but we don't have time to sit down and have deep discussions about important issues during the year. I have a couple of thank yous. First off, thank you to Renee and Tracy. They may not be on screen currently, but they are always working behind the scenes. Thank you to Daryl again for his leadership. And thank you to Lawrence and Professor Tyson for presenting today. I will now flip it to Lawrence.
Thanks, Justin. Thank you, Daryl. I really appreciate you guys having me on and assisting as a moderator this morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. I'm in Dallas, Texas, so it is 12:03, so afternoon. I'm pleased to be moderating this event and help facilitate this important discussion about gerrymandering and its impacts on communities of color with Louisiana State University Law School Professor Christopher Tyson. Professor Tyson is an expert in urban redevelopment and impact gerrymandering and also redistricting and how it has its public power on urban constituencies working to advance equitable development. Professor Tyson is currently the Newman Trowbridge Distinguished Professor of Law at Paul M. Hebert Law Center at Louisiana State University. Prior to earning his law degree, Professor Tyson worked in management consulting in Washington, D.C. office of the United States Senator Mary Landrieu. After earning his law degree, Professor Tyson worked as an associate in the real estate practice at the law firm Jones Walker in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. He's been honored as one of Baton Rouge's top 40 under 40 in 2010, the National Bar Association's top 40 lawyers under 40 for 2011, and the New Leaders Council's 2011 top 40 under 40 as well. He's also a recipient of the National Bar Association's and Impact 2011 Excellence in Activism Award. In 2015, Professor Tyson also was a Democratic candidate for the Louisiana Secretary of State. So he has the accolades, has a career and professional experience, and I know that the information that he will be presenting today is going to be insightful and impactful. And so now, Professor Tyson, I'll turn it to you and your discussion about gerrymandering and any questions that folks may have while you're speaking. Feel free to just type it in the chat, and after Professor Tyson does his initial remarks and comments about gerrymandering, we will be having a Q&A from the questions that you may post in the chat and any questions that I may decide to ask him. So go ahead, Professor Tyson. Thank you.
Well, good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. It's good to be with you. Thank you, Lawrence, for that introduction, and thank you, YLD, for the invitation. This is a timely topic given where we are in the nation and what we see unfolding in our communities and nationally with regards to democracy and participation, and how that breaks down across race and class and geography throughout the country. So it's an important conversation to be having right now, and I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to share with you. I look forward to the questions as well. I think this will work well as an interactive discussion, so I look forward to your participation. We talk about gerrymandering. We are essentially talking about processes that relate to redistricting, which takes us kind of even more broadly to how we affect the principles of one person, one vote across the country, and in relation to our decennial census. So as we know, every 10 years, we conduct a census of the country, and that is effectively trying to gauge the population of the nation, not only nationally, but obviously in the states and throughout. And that process, just kind of breaks down into our states and localities. We all go through the census process, and at the conclusion of that and the presentation of the data, we have an opportunity to adjust our districts, and not just Congress. We usually think about Congress in terms of redistricting and gerrymandering, but this affects every unit of political representation, all the way down to your school districts, your city councils, any forum where we are electing representatives, and we want to uphold the principles of one person, one vote, then that has to be anchored in something. And what we anchor that in is a census, which establishes a count of the population. And then we proceed to construct representative districts that are geographically bounded units, where the residents in those geographies will elect someone to represent them in a governing body, right? That is the basic architecture of our democracy. And so it's important to understand kind of how we get to the gerrymandering discussion, right? The line drawing and how we actually construct those districts as kind of, a broader process of the census and achieving one person, one vote. These questions about representation and how that impacts democracy, and particularly principles of fairness, have been vetted by our courts for at least the last 60 years, but even beyond if you go back there. I say 60 years because, I think the Gamillion v. Lightfoot case in 1960, which addressed racial gerrymandering, where Black citizens of Tuskegee, Alabama, literally had districts drawn that carved around their residences to exclude them from the political process in that city. The court in 1960 struck that down as a violation of the 15th Amendment protections. And so from there, we kind of start the 1960s, where we have a number of cases, Reynolds v. Sims, Baker v. Carr, where we establish one person, one vote, its application to the states. And from there, and you have to excuse me, my children are home because of a weather delay, and if you hear noise in the background, it's them. So apologies for that. But in the 60s, we have those Supreme Court cases, which really give us one person, one vote, and give us the application of that down to the states and their localities. And we also, most importantly, in the 60s, get the Voting Rights Act. And so much of what we're talking about today with regards to gerrymandering is related to the enforcement of the Voting Rights Act, which some of you may know received a significant blow by the Supreme Court in 2013 in the Shelby County v. Holder decision. And so that decision struck down the process of pre-clearance. I should say it didn't technically strike down pre-clearance. It invalidated the formula in the Voting Rights Act upon which pre-clearance was based, and left it to the Congress, to reassess on what basis pre-clearance should occur, and Congress has yet to do that. So prior to 2013, the protection that we had with every census and every subsequent redistricting cycle was that the maps would have to be pre-cleared by the Department of Justice or a panel of federal judges, as Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act requires. And that served as, kind of a check on any activities that would seek to exploit the redistricting process in ways that, brought about racially disparate results. And so in the wake of not only Shelby County v. Holder, but a few other decisions, which we may get to today, we've seen the court, I think, weaken the protections against the type of gerrymandering that could occur in a redistricting cycle, which unfairly burdens or benefits particular groups depending upon who's in power in a state and drawing those lines. Another point we should highlight about this, because we always talk about this in national terms. We think about our democracy in national terms, as we should, because there's a lot in the Constitution, as the court in numerous occasions has affirmed, which kind of grounds our rights to free and fair elections and participation. But the reality of our system of democracy, and voting in particular, is a profoundly decentralized one, right? We don't have a national election system, right? We have state election systems, and those vary considerably when you get into the minutia of how states run elections and how they do redistricting, and the potential for abuse or disparate impacts in that case. And so this profoundly decentralized architecture of democracy is a defining feature of American democracy. Secretaries of state in the states, and moreover, really in many states, it devolves all the way down to the county level, where election administration and who gets access to the ballot and how voter rolls are maintained, and a whole host of administrative functions which go to the heart of how we experience participation and democracy are profoundly decentralized. But with regards to the redistricting process, states have different processes for how they draw maps. Most of the states have left it to the negotiations and political driven processes of state legislatures, and many people feel that inevitably leads to a politicized result. And so we've seen that. We see an increase as we are the first redistricting cycle since Shelby County v. Holder, right? This is the first time we're going to draw maps since the 1970 cycle, where we do not have a requirement of pre-clearance as a check on abuses of that process. So most recently, in 2019, the Supreme Court heard a case, Rucho v. Common Cause. And in this case, the Supreme Court confronted a partisan gerrymandering claim out of North Carolina. And the court examined this partisan claim, which if you read the case, and particularly Justice Kagan's very forceful dissent in this case, this was a 5-4 decision, breaking down according to the kind of, at that time, 5-4, if you want, liberal conservative split on the Supreme Court. But that case decided that issues of partisan gerrymandering were not justiciable for federal courts, right? That there wasn't, the court wasn't able to review these cases, which many found, including the strongly worded dissent and the dissenting judges, to be a pretty remarkable departure from a number of precedents that the court had long relied upon to allow for judicial review, particularly in the court's ability to enforce the 14th and First Amendments. And so Rucho is kind of where we leave off with the court's decisions on partisan gerrymandering. That case was involving, Democratic versus Republican power, but we have good reason to be concerned about how that impacts racially, because we have still very racially divided voting patterns in the country. Black voters in federal elections vote significantly for Democrats. And when you look at various segments of the white voting population, white men in particular, overwhelmingly vote Republican. White women are a little more split, with the advantage, I think, being slightly Republican. And again, these are in federal elections. People sometimes tend to, behave differently in federal elections than they do in local elections. But by and large, mountains of data verify that we still have racially polarized voting. And so to the extent that partisan affiliation can be a proxy for race, we should be concerned. And again, the Rucho case addressed the issue of partisan gerrymandering, but again, Justice Kagan's dissent, I think, is worth reading to get an understanding of how that case represents, a broader departure from just the basic issue of judicial review in these matters. And again, the majority in that opinion said that there were no standards upon which the court could rely to fairly adjudicate a partisan gerrymandering claim, and the dissenting opinions, kind of brought to bear the number of criteria that federal courts have for long periods used to adjudicate such cases. So, a strong dissent there, and to the extent that we see patterns of what some scholars have called, case baiting in dissenting opinions, where our courts are writing dissenting opinions, to strongly put things in the record to encourage litigation and kind of signal to lawyers and advocates what other possible avenues there may be to bring litigation to address a particular issue. I think that Justice Kagan's dissent in Rucho is of that, of that variety. So we have concern with regards to the impact on traditionally marginalized communities along race or class or what have you, given what we're seeing, kind of post Shelby County v. Holder, I would say, post pre-clearance in every aspect of democracy, but most importantly, redistricting. How that, kind of trickles down into how communities experience this on the ground is also important, and maybe not obvious. And I'll talk just a second on that. And I think, Lawrence, we're probably getting to a point of opening up for some questions. But again, we're not just talking about Congress, which is significant, because obviously who we send to Congress to represent us is important. We know that, and being able to for different groups to achieve results in that body through federal legislation, also through the ability to impact legislation that impacts the administrative agencies, so on and so forth. So tremendously important what happens at Congress, but equally important in some instances, as a professor of local government law, as I tell my students, most of the action that relates to our experience with democracy occurs at the local level. We are in a period of, arguably, maybe not unprecedented, but certainly a level of federal spending that we haven't seen in several generations. And so funds are flowing into states and local governments. And it will be before bodies at the city level, at the county level, at the state level, and school boards and what have you, to decide how those funds are deployed. If, for instance, as I'm often, find myself arguing as somebody who's worked in urban redevelopment and sees that as a issue of equity and fairness and creating opportunity, if you have funds that are available, that as ARPA, the American Rescue Act that we've had for COVID, the infrastructure dollars that are on their way to cities and states, who gets to decide how those are spent? Who gets to set priorities for how those dollars are spent? And what broader critique of needs and priorities do we have, that is, undergirding, that priority setting is profoundly important, right? And so we will have opportunities to address affordable housing in a systemic way or not. We'll have opportunities to address a small business help and minority business growth or not. We will have opportunities to address issues in policing and how we address violence in our communities through greater incarceration and more draconian policing, or through a more varied approach that deals with mental health and counseling and building up capacity of urban communities where violence is most experienced and where people live in cycles of deprivation and scarcity. How these resources can be brought to bear is going to come down to who's making those decisions and who's deciding. And so who's elected is a function of how those districts are drawn and what majorities or minorities exist in those districts, who has voice, who is able to elect representatives of their choosing. If as we see in redistricting schemes, the risk is that minority members of the population will be dispersed into multiple districts where they are not able to affect the outcome in any of those district elections, or they will be packed into one district and therefore marginalized as far as they're represented in the legislative body, and unable to influence the outcome in other districts. And those types of those two threats have impacted minority representation and our racial politics. That was the part of the driving force for the Voting Rights Act, was to prevent that. Now, there's also politics involved in this. Here in my state, in Louisiana, our governor has agreed to veto the congressional maps, which did not change the majority minority district ratios from the last census. Louisiana is roughly a third Black, and with 6 seats, the governor and others said that we should at least have 2 congressional districts to elect for minority candidates in Louisiana. That's predominantly Black candidates, Black voters, to elect a candidate of their choosing. We only have 1 district now. So he has vowed to veto that, but he did not vow to veto the legislative map, which also made no change in the racial districting or demographics of our districts at the state legislative level. So most of the decisions that will impact Louisianans will occur in the state legislature. We have no, we've not made up any ground after this census so far. So that is troubling. But we also have to address, as we also see in these instances, that where we have minority districts that are upwards of 60% majority minority districts, that can present a safe political scenario for an incumbent who may not want to redistribute some of that Black population to build up representation in other districts to increase the influence. And even if you maybe aren't able to elect a Black candidate, you are certainly able to influence the outcome of the election such that you get more moderate candidates that also, will hopefully, behave differently or reflect the diversity of the district in the body. So we have those issues as well. And we've seen in some instances, here in Louisiana and around the country, we also sometimes have incumbent Black representatives who are hostile to having their kind of supermajority populations reduced so that you can reallocate that population in other districts to increase the force and influence of those voters in other districts. That's also a political dimension of what we face in this process. So very complicated issue, but I think where we are now, I think with the Rucho decision and still feeling the fallout from Shelby County v. Holder almost 10 years later, it is a precarious moment for our democracy, and I think a precarious moment particularly for minority representation, Black representation in particular, given our racial history and the cumulative and intergenerational impacts of that. So Lawrence, I'll pause there. I know you had some questions, and I hope others do as well. And if I've left anything out, if there are any holes, I'm happy to kind of double click on any of that and expound further.
Sure thing. So we've got one comment in the chat. Catherine O'Quinn said she loved the Sotomayor and Kagan dissent. But no questions as
yeah.
I was just gonna say no questions as of right now. Oh, Ashley's popping up. She's got her hand up. So Ashley, you wanna go ahead?
I would say thank you so much for talking about this topic. So the question I have is, well, I live in North Carolina, but I'm still very much tied to New York. And how do you, at least, I know with the districting maps, that's the thing, is like they're putting forth two maps. And like most states are saying, like there's a Republican map, there's a Democratic map, because they're trying to gerrymander or redistrict these populations, break up the Black populations or break up the predominantly Hispanic population. So how do you even like address that concern, or like what would you say, like which map do we choose, or how do you at least inform people that this is going on?
Yeah, I think that advocates and others have to make this a more accessible issue. I don't know that it is, and we tend to only talk about it every 10 years. So that's also a problem. I'd say in the last, few decades, right? If you go back to, the origins of the Voting Rights Act, and we're looking at, the 1960s and the legislative and judicial accomplishments of the 1960s kind of gave, birth to a whole new wave of Black political representation in cities throughout the country. It was unprecedented. Black mayors, Black members of legislative bodies in Congress, kind of ushered in the 70s. And the idea was that we needed, because of racially polarized voting, we needed majority minority districts to ensure that not only that those voters in those districts would be able to elect someone of their choosing, but that we would get actual Black and minority representation, right? That it matters that Hispanic members and Black members and Asian members are serving in Congress, because there's this representation reinforcement role that is being served by having people who come from that experience, represent the demographic in their body, right? In who they are, in their identity. And that has served us well in many instances. Racially polarized voting persists. But the downside of that is that in some states, and I would include Louisiana, we've so packed Black voters or minority voters into certain districts that the block of representatives in the larger body is largely ineffective, because they're below a veto threshold, or over, they don't have the ability to really impact legislation, except in the most extreme circumstances. And so that has led to a broader discussion of coalition districts, right? And influence districts, where we may not be electing someone who is of the same identity as the minority population, but the minority population has the ability to influence the outcome such that you get a more moderate candidate, and the politics that occur in the body, shift. And I think we're still, trying to reconcile those issues, because we still have racially polarized voting, and identity still matters. I think if we've been watching the Justice Jackson hearings, we know that these issues of identity in some instances have not changed, in some instances are regressing. And so it matters that a Black woman is on the Supreme Court. It matters. But it also matters that in legislative bodies, particularly state legislatures and city councils, that we not so pack minority voters in for the sake of getting someone who identifies with them in the seat, that once that person gets to the body, they're ineffective. And so that, I think, is attention. And to your broader question, I know it's kind of a way around. It took you on a long route to answer that question. It's difficult, and I think it does come down to the data on the ground about how we structure those maps, and what we see as the ultimate goal that we're trying to achieve, which I think ends up being majority districts that allow for the election of a candidate whose identity reflects that district, and that's usually going to be north of 60-65%, or influence districts, which can be anywhere from 40 to 60%, and we have the minority voting population has a strong chance of influencing the type of candidate that gets elected, and hopefully the type of politics they carry with them to the legislative body. So I don't know if I directly answered your question, but those are just some of my thoughts.
Thanks, Ashley. So I've got a few questions. Oh, all right, Catherine just chimed in perfectly, right on time. So I can ask your question for you, Catherine, unless you want to jump in and ask it yourself. But totally happy to just ask it for you. So Catherine asks, how can we help at a local level? She says that this outrages her and it's hard for her to understand. She lives in Alabama and she has many disagreements with those making these type of decisions. The advocacy groups in the areas make lobbying efforts in the area, but also it's hard for people to help just to understand how outrageous it is. And so she's asking, how can she contribute and help advance this cause?
Yeah, I thought about that before getting on the call, kind of anticipating that question. I will just reflecting here on what we've experienced or experiencing in Louisiana. and I will say I was not involved in any advocacy efforts, and really just kind of observing like everyone else what was going on. But I think that there's still an opportunity for greater advocacy and public education around these issues, and more than just every 10 years. I think it's tough. You all are attorneys. We're here talking about Rucho v. Common Cause and Justice Kagan's dissent and blah blah blah. That's not an accessible conversation for really anybody. And we have to figure out how to keep these issues alive, not just in 10 years, but in the period in between, and helping people understand and think through these issues. It's hard when you have, and we've seen this in the politics here locally. I say in the state of Louisiana, where you have frankly, Black elected representatives who are concerned about having the Black population in their districts go down, below a certain threshold, because it could impact their incumbency. It could also result in an outcome that doesn't elect another Black person to the legislative body, and that is of a concern. And so, in the heat of those discussions, if we don't really have time to really sit back and think through all of this and weigh these competing values and interests, I think it's I think we do ourselves and our communities a disservice. So I would say that finding ways to create, I think, accessible conversations with decision makers and advocates, and with all due respect to the people working on this issue. This is, again, it's not the easiest stuff to really get, and it's hard to think about in the heat of battle every 10 years, right? And we really need to do a better job, I think, of getting information to our advocates across a variety of interest areas that are ultimately impacted by this, and equipping them with tools to understand this, so that when we get to 2030, we're ready for, and if that is that, hey, people want to make sure that we retain a certain representation, and therefore, if we still have racially polarized voting, then we still want to have majority and minority districts, or that we realize that the Louisiana Black Caucus in the state legislature has a limited amount of legislative influence that they can bring about, and we've seen that across a number of issues that are very important to the state's 1/3 Black population, and so maybe we want to not have such racially polarized representatives, and we want to have districts that allow Black representatives or Black constituents to maybe not necessarily elect someone Black, although that could happen, but more importantly, to elect more moderate candidates that represent their values more fully, and therefore can contribute to coalitions in the legislature that also drive outcomes. That is a discussion, and I just kind of gave that to you in, very law professor like speech, and that's not fun for anybody, and it's not accessible, and so we've got to figure that out. And so I would say, how can the Young Lawyers Division, or how can other groups that you're interested in start this, keep this conversation going, so that people are equipped and ready in 2030, to the extent that 2020 battles aren't already decided, and I know some of them are still in process. But I think that we need to better equip our communities to understand these issues and the hard choices and competing issues that underlie them.
Thanks, Professor Tyson. I will see if anybody has, and Catherine said thank you as well.
Yeah.
I'll see if anybody has any other questions. I know we plan to do a breakout session here at 12:45, so we've got a few minutes for one last question. If anybody doesn't ask one, I can ask one of my questions that I prepared. Because of course, being a moderator, I'm like, all right, I got to look up what we're talking about and know what's going on. So I did see that, you know, there were two different court cases, one in Pennsylvania and one in North Carolina, about some of their redistricting maps that were drawn. And I think the state courts wanted it to be brought up to the Supreme Court to have them decide on the legitimacy of those maps. And I know that the Supreme Court decided not to hear those cases and not to rule on them. But I also read some reports that it could be plausible that states may move to try to do that redistricting after midterm elections. And so one thing that I was wondering is, okay, if that was to be the case, like how would that affect communities of color? So if after the midterm elections are complete and then states are seeking to redistrict some of their congressional maps, like how does that impact decisions that were made based on the midterm elections and going into the presidential election?
Well, I mean, at a certain level, it's no different than when we redistrict, after the decennial census. And obviously, with the 2020 census, COVID, threw a monkey wrench in things. So the census was delayed, and states' ability to redraw maps has been delayed. So, we're in 2022. Usually, states we'd be past this already, and things would be clear for the midterms. We'd know kind of what those districts were. But when those lines are redrawn, the incumbent, is now in a newly constructed district. She may have old precincts, she may have new precincts, and that may or may not impact her ability to get reelected. And so, but it just that's just dealt with in the legislative in the election cycle. I think many commentators kind of were looking askance at the court like, okay, so it's too close to the election, and that was the kind of reason for not hearing those cases was suspect to many. Again, we are in a climate where we are seeing unprecedented attacks at the state level on the processes of voting, the qualifications for who can vote, access to the ballot. We're seeing, retrenchment, unlike anything since the Voting Rights Act in American politics. And so, the impact to minority communities from those recent decisions not to hear those cases, I think, exists in a broader context of how all of these impacts on representative democracy impact minority communities. And again, I will stress that in this period of approaching New Deal level type of federal engagement in state and local affairs, which I think is great because it gives us the opportunity to shore up so many deficits that exist that ultimately, disproportionately impact minority communities. But the decisions that we're making, I'm going to go to the urban context. We built the highways, after the Eisenhower Act. We built the highways on 90-10 federal money, which meant that the federal government put up 90% of the money, the local government put up 10% of the money, and that's how we created a national system of highways. All of the siting decisions, and I'm saying SITING, all of the siting decisions were made at the local level, which meant in the 1950s and 60s, they were made with the imperative of enforcing and maintaining racial residential segregation and marginalizing, Black communities. And so we know what the impacts are of what a lack of representation, effective representation, can mean in the face of a flood of federal dollars intended to build up new infrastructure, new public services, that can either lessen disparities and inequality or exacerbate it. So we know what the stakes are just from looking at not that long ago history. So that's what's at stake yet again.
So I hope everybody engaged in some wonderful discussion about, maybe some of the challenges that we're facing with redistricting and gerrymandering. We're also talking about what we can do as young lawyers to advocate for people who may not be as versed within the subject. As Professor Tyson alluded to, this isn't an easy topic to always discuss, but it's one that impacts us on a very personal level, and I think even more than we even know. So I guess I just want to say thank you so much to all the attendees. Thank you, Professor Tyson. I'd leave you a few moments if you want to say any last remarks. Professor Tyson. I think you're muted. Somebody, let's see.
Can you hear me now?
Yes,
yeah.
sir.
Thank you all again for the invitation and for your time. I enjoyed the conversation. It's a very important one. So I commend you for having it and taking this back into your respective communities and stressing the importance of understanding these issues. As lawyers, we have the ability to be agents for social change because we understand the basis upon which our rights exist in this democracy. And so you have the ability to make accessible and make understandable and these issues for a broader audience. And so that don't underestimate the amount of change that can flow from just that action. It's the only thing that has ever made change. So again, I commend you for having this discussion. Thank you for having me, and good afternoon.
Thank you so much, Professor Tyson. I think you definitely left us with a great charge to move forward as young lawyers and hoping to advocate for others. So I just want to say thank you again for your time. Thank you, Justin, Jack, for helping organize this. Thank you, Tracy Kemp, and also Daryl Wilson for helping organize this discussion. It's been a great time to spend our lunch hour, and I hope everybody has a wonderful rest of your day.